Welcome to Morning at NTV. In case you're just joining us, if you have been a part of the show, the hashtag is Morning at NTV. On Kickstarter this morning, we're going to be having a conversation about the media. At some point during the President's directives, one of the groups that was eventually classified as essential were the media. But looking at how it has been for them during these times, I am joined by Mr. Robert Sempala, who is Executive Director for the Human Rights Network for Journalists within the country. Welcome to Morning at NTV.
Thank you for having me, Rita.
And I'm also joined by Ms. Charlotte Ogwang, who is the Project Officer at Human Rights Network for Journalists in the country. Welcome to Morning at NTV.
Thank you, Rita.
I would like to start with how it has been for the both of you when it comes to journalists, the plight of the journalists during this time, and I'll start with you, Charlotte.
We have had usually interface with journalists year in and year out. Because Human Rights Network for Journalists looks at the rights of journalists. It's anchored towards promoting and enhancing the rights of journalists, and this is done through capacity enhancement, through offering legal aid to them in the different parts of the country. And as HRNJ, we have been deeply rooted in ensuring that we build the capacity of journalists, because as we have always interfaced with the journalists, you find that most of them have come into the industry and have not been like trained to have that hands-on experience. So you find that a lot is missing, and if we don't continuously build their capacity in these areas, you find that it's some bit of a gap that most of the media houses don't look into. So they just pick on a journalist and up and go into the field, and yet they need someone to mentor them day in and day out, up to a certain stage where they can go by themselves. But this is a bit lacking in this current day, and HRNJ is bridging the gap everywhere we go, even the grassroots in different areas, when northern Uganda, eastern Uganda, basically it's all region. Karamoja, you go to Kasese, you go to all these different parts of the country. So that's part of the work that HRNJ is doing. Okay. Yes, Rita.
So just to bring you into the conversation, Robert, when we talk about capacity, for many sectors within the country, the COVID-19 pandemic took them by surprise, like any other pandemic would. And one of the things that happened is that we had to cope with this new normal. What did the new normal look like for journalists?
I call it the new abnormal because it came with lots of challenges. Like you said, the media was categorized as essential service providers, but it only came with a name. There was not a lot fundamentally changing to scale the media to these essentials, because we saw many journalists being beaten, arrested, and even put in, those that worked beyond curfew time, even when they could ably identify themselves with security. We would see journalists being laid off their work, their salaries slashed, and most of them do not know how to cope. There was no special arrangement by these essential service providers. The government left it all to the owners, who even before then were struggling to break even. So it was extremely a big challenge. And while everybody managed to stay home, work from their internets and Zooming and all that stuff, journalists kept going to the front line, picking information, disseminating it to the wider public. And we attribute all the successes of this fight against the pandemic, for me, to the media, because while everybody would sit in their living rooms, put up across their messages, they would go back to their beds, but the journalists run around with this information, struggle with breaking it down to simplest forms for the communities to absorb. So it wasn't an easy thing. But what made it worse was the dwindling revenues that come to media houses through advertisements and promotions. All those things were cut because businesses had literally closed at some point. It's really been a very huge challenge. But the most thing that stood out for us is a failure by security to appreciate the role that the media was doing, and their guys going ahead to beat journalists who were in Entebbe recently. A reporter for a local radio station, CBS, was beaten by about 5 LDUs. even when he identified himself, they confiscated his gadgets, beat him up, and to date he has not gotten justice. And many of such cases continue happening during this period.
Now, when you talk about the beating of journalists, it's not the first time it's happening within the country, and even with the unusual times, such things continue to happen. What does that portray about the relationship that the media has with security within this country, and given the fact that we're going forward when it comes to elections?
It really shows, one, failure to appreciate the role that the media plays in a society by security agents. Two, it points to a relationship that continues to sour by the day. We've continuously engaged in dialogues, in making sure we bring ourselves to speed with how each of us does their work, to make sure that we get a buy-in by the security guys, to learn how to live with journalists. But we think that this has a backdrop of the training where these guys are trained to this level. They scare them a lot that if you see this journalist with a gadget, is your enemy, please take charge. And this, we have it from very credible sources, and that narrative must change if we must do away with these attacks, because most of the journalists that have been attacked have been in the line of duty. You clearly can identify them. Very few cases of mistaken identities. So we think that even the leadership or the authorities of the security management of security or leadership has not done enough, to categorically come out and pronounce themselves on these attacks.
So those are people we need to be taking a look at. Because if you say dialogue has happened, what next after dialogue?
Yes. You expect that in a democratic society you dialogue. When dialogue fails, you dialogue, and you dialogue again and dialogue again. Because if you do not, you're going to resort to use of violence. And certainly we are in a very unprivileged position when it comes to violence, because these guys are armed to teeth. We cannot engage them physically. So all we can do is continue dialoguing, do a lot of advocacy and lobbying. At some point we've resorted to courts of law, but the process is fairly longer, it's very costly, so you can't think that is the best way out. But we must continue dialoguing and bring it to impressing it on them that the media has to live and has to do its work. We have to keep rubbing it in, and this is what we are doing. But also build the capacities of journalists, because there are some cases where you see journalists have gone overboard, where you see journalists are at fault, and you really bring it to them that, man, look what you did. What did you expect from this guy? You have a Zoom camera, you choose to come and stand into his face. This guy has been in the scorching sun the whole day, is inhaling tear gas and so much, so you do not provoke him further. Zoom out, they call it zoom in or out, from a distance, and have your image relayed in your respective media house. Those are things that we must continue doing. But all we must say that the media has really had it rough during this COVID period.
Now, when you say they've had it rough during this COVID period, I'll just bring in Charlotte once again. When it comes to, we'll generalize and say every journalist has had it rough. But what about the plight of the women journalists within this time?
That has been a very big challenge for most of the female journalists, because of the restrictions of transport, and you find that most of them do not have the means to get home, so it's a bit hard for them. They have to walk, so they get home late. So the challenges which come along the way, and I've been having also this interface with most of the security personnel on the road. You find that some are beaten, and the actual fear of any lady while they're on the road, chances of getting raped, of getting beaten, has always been on their minds. And you find that as they go out, as they've actually been going out there, some have held back, and that means there's a financial restraint into their families. And considering that most of the journalists are paid per story, so you have to have your story published in order for you to get paid. So at the end of the day, if you do not have this, there's a financial restraint at home. And now considering that they had to, with the COVID ban, they have to walk home, and they reach home late, and this is a big GBV issue at home. Gender-based violence, you find that their husbands are having quarrels here and there with them. So there's a lot of support that needs to come in from the families, from the community that they interface with, and also from the media house. How can they ensure that they mainstream issues of gender within their media houses? How can they facilitate the female journalists, and how can they ensure that their safety is guaranteed even when they work late?
Is that going to change a few things within when it comes to, say, documentation within a media house? Say that perhaps we'll have to have you on a particular kind of contract for sustainability. Are we going to see a change in conversation about contracts within the media houses going forward?
These conversations need to be looked into deeply, especially with the proprietors, because they don't seem to prioritize contracts of most of the journalists, and yet they contribute to the income generating into each and every media house. So if we could, we have had actually conversations with most of these proprietors up country, and we have seen some change, but others have been adamant. They have chosen to lay back and
why are they choosing to be adamant? Where is the issue there that's stopping them? Now,
their complaints comes with taxes, that they're being taxed highly by UCC and all that, but and we need to bring the regulators on board. But in the previous conversations, we have had a challenge to get through with UCC as HRNJ Uganda. You put in invitations to go and have a conversation with them, and they don't seem to send back and call you in to come and have this conversation with them, and yet they are very key in within the media fraternity. So if they lay back, then there's a very great challenge to ensure that these issues of contracts and taxes to the media houses are streamlined. So it is very key for them to listen, because freedom of expression and information out there it's a public good for each and every one, not only the people who are at the forefront, not only journalists, not only any other media personality, but even as a recipient of that news. You have to be sure that the news you're being given is credible enough. If it is not credible, then we blame others, and yet it's not only the journalists that we should blame.
So yes. When you say we should take it as an entire community responsibility,
exactly.
This is when I bring you in, Robert, this community responsibility. We speak of the regulators, but there's the end consumer of whatever, who's on the other side watching us this morning. How can they help the journalists today, given that the times are not usual, they're not about to go back to the usual way? So what can someone do to help?
A bit before I get into there, Prosser left out the issue of most of the journalists being single mothers. I know majority of them being single mothers, and so when their incomes dwindle, certainly have lots of challenges in their homes. I know it for a fact, and I've been trying to help out some of my colleagues who tell you, you see, I'm really seated home, I can't break through, my kid, ABCD. A lot has been really happening that the female journalists have not been able to come to speak out to the public, but they are suffering. Now about the communities. We have an initiative that sees us reach out to communities in the remotest senses of the country by holding community dialogue meetings. We call it media community dialogues, where we engage ordinary wananchi, bring them with leadership of their communities, and speak to them about the role of the media, about the challenges that we go through, and inviting them to lend a hand where they can. And it's in that very vein that we've seen some people come out to give food to journalists during this COVID period. Some have offered to kind of relax the rent for some journalists. I know a few that have because we've engaged them. But the communities are also kind of disempowered in a sense that their ability to influence course of events is really limited. We instead think that the ownership of the media houses should be systematically engaged, and also lobby them, because most of them have what it takes to remedy the situation, but they're just like too laid back. There is a very big gap between the boardroom and the newsroom. You know, the boardroom will mean the management of media houses. They do not really feel and empathize with the journalists that go through these hardships. There is a kind of a comfort zone within the boardroom, and the challenges that happen below in here may really don't rub them the right way, and some of them have chosen to ignore. We have situations where a journalist say has to report to police or to go to court, and this editor goes ahead to assign them, saying you have to be here. Sometimes they tell them don't appear anywhere, we don't want you to be in court for any reasons. These things will be sorted by management, and these journalists inside they're crying, and they're bleeding with a lot of anger, but they force them to come out and say we reconcile, this matter was sorted, yet it hasn't. So the community can play a part, especially through their leadership, their baby representatives, talk to their sons and daughters and everybody that is in a position of influence, and we realize that them being the end users, they really need to appreciate the predicament that the media is in, so that they do not add salt into the injuries themselves.
How can they stop that? Because sometimes you don't even know you're doing it when you're doing it.
Yes, we tell them, and sometimes they really come out to confess that, oh, so I was also a human rights defender, so I defend journalists when I said this, by say capturing a video when a journalist is being beaten, by showing up at the police to record a statement in support of pursuit of justice for a journalist, all those things that we impress upon them, but also to educate them on who wields which power in a media house. For instance, a journalist that goes to fish for a story is not the final person to determine the shape of the story. We tell them there is an editor, there is a manager in the media house. If you really are aggrieved, please walk over there, look at the newspaper at the bottom and see the lines in there. Call. If your position was misrepresented, do not beat the messenger, the person who comes to you in good faith. Please call and say this is missing in this part, and you will be given an opportunity. So in that we are trying to scale down on the attacks they are generating from the communities themselves, because most of them act out of ignorance, and we appreciate that very few people are schooled in this industry. We even have gone to court, and the lawyers or even the judges or magistrates will tell you that for us to not study this, we do not know so much about the media law. So we have to keep engaging different communities in this regard, not only the 1 inches down there, but even the leads.
Okay, well, now taking it to how most people have now moved away from the traditional into the social media, most especially during this time, it has continued to be something that has come to the top, and innovations within the internet. Now bringing in Charlotte on this, how do you see the media going forward when it comes to social media and the traditional media, and journalists, putting journalists into that?
Social media and journalists, for example, it's important. It's actually good for them to venture into that. But then the challenge they have is the social media has a lot of people who are not conversant and not actually conversant with the key professional norms of how work of journalists is done. So someone will just pick on a story and just put it on social media, and they don't really think about looking into the nitty-gritties of that story, because any story that is put forward, it should have been thoroughly checked for the accuracy in that story. Has it been fairly written? Have you looked at all the parties involved in that story, and have you heard what they have to say? But the current day situation, it's not what is happening. Someone picks on a story, takes a video and just puts it right there, but then the facts of the story, so the blame eventually gets back to you as an individual, and some of the journalists are caught within. But most of them have we have interfaced with some of them who have chosen to come up with websites and you find that they at least look deep into a story before it is then put onto their websites and different other social media platforms, and we appreciate that approach that they have taken.
Just to add a little, by way of copying, most media houses have also adopted to online medias, online information releases. You have a printer media house, but goes ahead to have an online, just to contend with the situation. But also now it brings in the issue of timeliness. You can't now sit with the news for hours before you release it. You have to keep breaking the news in the course of the day, because the other ordinary people will capture video, put it there, and it's raw. Most media houses have been acting out of self-censorship, and so there are things that they will leave out. This guy will capture Bobi Wine being beaten and he throws it in there. It is 15 minutes. For you, you're thinking of 1 minute for Bobi Wine because you fear reprisals. A guy has already done it, so you have to adjust and get a way of fitting in. Or else people are already serving themselves with the raw information, which actually has it 100%, much as it misses out on what Process talked about, the key tenets of journalism. It misses it out, but who cares? A farmer will just say, I have all of it. Museveni is speaking and the speech is captured by this person on TV and relays it out to the wider public. So the advent of social media is really a big challenge, and the media houses have learned how to scale it up in order to cope. Otherwise, it's also another alternative way of giving information to the public that would never find space within the mainstream media for fear. Self-censorship is at its worst at some point, and the guys used to do that.
Okay, now
but also, Rita, we shouldn't put aside the traditional media, because there are people who do not have access to the social media platforms and other internet, for example. There are people who just stand by the roadside and just read newspaper and get to know what is happening, and they do not have access to.
They stop at headlines.
Yes, they stop at the headlines. Then if they have an opportunity for someone to buy it and look into it, they keep around. And we also have to appreciate that media should also continue using these platforms, because there are people who can't afford.
Yes, so they just have to both coexist.
Exactly.
And speaking of the coexisting of these two, what we're getting into now with the 2021 general elections, the revised roadmap that was released by the Electoral Commission last week, seems to show that these two can coexist, with the way they're saying that the campaigns will be virtual, they can be on television and radio, plus also social media. And what are your thoughts on that, Robert?
I think it is a very big challenge that the media is being handed to. We have had enormous challenges with the media covering elections, covering politics, covering, those covering political bits have really had it rough. We've had a lot of political intolerance on the part of those in power. The security guys will descend on a person like they did in Arua, NTV journalist Ronald and his parliamentary reporter, who is it? Yes, Ziwa, and the rest. They were beating them for no reason, for no offense committed. They tie their hands up, put them in a coaster, step on their chests, and now their file is gathering dust in Gulu. Nothing is happening. So we do not know if anything was discussed around the possibility of overzealous security officers who will not let journalists do their work. We don't know if we have discussed possibilities of power cuts where journalists cannot, media houses cannot be able to relay their programs. We haven't discussed issues of security, RDCs, and so many people there storming media houses and throwing out political figures before they even say anything. So for them see a crime that is about to be committed and they throw them out, they vandalize the studios, and no offense to them is committed. We have not discussed the capacity and ability of media houses to take on this role. We have so many professional gaps in the media. We must appreciate that as well. And we also have districts that have no media outlets.
Yes. Now, speaking of those discussions, just to stop you right there, those discussions, you mentioned the fact that even just getting the regulator, UCC, into conversations is an issue. The Electoral Commission is also now an issue there, because how do we go forward? What is the plan? What is the structure of all of this? The gap in those discussions, How does it trickle down to what eventually is going to be put out by the media houses?
I think what we need to do immediately is to embark on coming up with a set of regulations that one will apply or appeal to the owners in case the owners deny me space because they are politicians and most of them have vested interest in the political seats that some of these contenders are vying for, and they say so and so cannot speak on my radio or cannot appear in a newspaper that I manage, or what is going to be done? What are the reprimands for that? Two, what do you do in case I pay for my money and then the media house chooses to return it to me because I've been intimidated, which has happened many times. It has even been in court. What do you do? Does that make the process free, fair and credible? Certainly no. What do you do to media houses that are struggling in terms of finances, and they have at this point to adjust their programming to cater for campaigns? Who is going to fill up that gap in terms of incomes that have been coming from the programs? And what capacity do we have to monitor to see that the media has been free and fair to the politicians? So what for me I think should have been done in the first place is to conduct wild consultations across the board, for the Electoral Commission to have talked to all the actors. What is happening now is that the roadmap is being implemented because political parties are already nominating their candidates in the process. So you cannot even purport to be consulting at this point on a process that is already being implemented. We think that a lot has to be done, and in the earliest, the Parliament should come up with these regulations, and these regulations should be widely consultative. What happens to a journalist that is biased? Because we have seen some journalists that are political assistants of politicians. They speak for politicians, and they are the regional, say, bureau chiefs of a particular media house. Where is the fairness going to come from? I think the media was handled with a very huge job, and the government did not demonstrate prior planning. Because also the taxes are really killing so many media houses. Taxes have to be slashed, and government also has to come up with a buffer fund to support these media houses, and this fund should be accessible to all media houses, not only the ones in Kampala. Because during the COVID there was an allocation to media houses to a tune of 6 billion, but you talk to so many media houses, they don't know where it has gone to, and that is
news to some people right now as you speak. So.
Yeah, it was even initially 14 billion that was being asked for. I was called in at some point to defend this particular budget as a media rights organization. We said yes, the media needs even more money. It was given 6 billion, but how it has managed to bridge gaps within media houses, nobody can tell. So how are we taking care of such challenges before you can say that the media is going to be the sole campaign platform for 2021 elections?
Well, we'll wait to see what comes out of, perhaps the Electoral Commission is listening, and also all those that the stakeholders, because what we're seeing now is that they're going back to perhaps talk to each and every individual, but what comes of that is what we wait to see. Our conversation this morning has been about the media, the ones that were part of the essential workers at some point, and I believe now it has come to the top that they are a big integral part of the community when it comes to bringing information to them.
Exactly. There's a journalist who's being detained at SIU since Monday because he wrote about a letter by the Archbishop that even ran in the media, and we really want this guy to be released, Ronald Nahabwe.
Yes.
It's not the practice that you detain people because they have written about you without presenting them to court.
I believe that the network will be doing something. I believe you're doing some work on that, and we'll wait to follow up with that. Well, that was our conversation this morning, joined by Mr. Robert Sempala, who is Executive Director of the Human Rights Network for journalists, I beg your pardon. And we have Ms. Charlotte Prosi Ogwang, who is the Project Officer at the Human Rights Network for Journalists. Thank you so much for joining us on Morning at NTV.
She works with the DJF project. DJF, yeah.
Well, we're now going to be getting into a conversation with the man behind the brand, and that is Mr. Peter Kawuju, who is the outgoing spokesperson of KCCA, and that is Stephen Mbide right there. We'll be having a conversation with.